We're going to talk about the BSL Act Now campaign in a few moments. But before we get onto that, can you, David, give us a little bit of the background on the British Deaf Association, who you are, and the work you do?
Sure, yes. So the British Deaf Association was established in 1890, and that was established directly in response to an international conference held in Milan of educators of the deaf. And that was in 1880. As part of that meeting, it was decided that deaf children should no longer be educated in sign language. So, effectively, a prohibition on teaching deaf children in sign language. The British Deaf and Dumb Association, as it was known then, was established to campaign for sign language rights. And here we are today, still campaigning for legal recognition of British Sign Language.
And on to the Act Now campaign, which is aligned with this private members bill that Rosie Cooper has introduced. Could you lay out the background for us? So what is the current situation in the UK, and what is the change that you'd like to see with regards to BSL being recognised as an official language?
Sure. So we formed the BSL Act Now campaign last year, and that was directly in response to reaching the 18-year mark since the government recognised British Sign Language by ministerial statement in 2003. And in 2003, the belief was that that was a first step. That was the first, path that we would walk down, which would lead us towards legal recognition. But we got to the point last year when we thought, well, we're 18 years down the line. We celebrate Sign Language Week on the week of the 18th of March. And last year we decided, actually, we're not going to celebrate Sign Language Week anymore. We're actually not going to celebrate it until we get legal recognition of the language. So that was the start of it. We got in touch with lots of MPs to see whether they would be willing and able to use their private members' bill should they come out of the ballot to support our campaign. Here we are today at the committee stage, having got through the second reading in January.
And what difference would it make to the lives of deaf and hard of hearing people in the UK? What would be the ripple effects, the changes that happened as a result of this?
Yeah, so that's a good question. If I take a step back from the detail of this private members bill in and of itself, and I talk about the campaign, the reason we wanted legal recognition of British Sign Language is because whilst we have the Equality Act on the statute book, and clearly deafness is a protected characteristic underneath the terms of the Equality Act, there is no reference to sign language in the Equality Act whatsoever. So when a decision maker has to determine what is or is not a reasonable adjustment, it can be quite difficult for them to determine that sign language interpretation, services directly in sign language are required under the Equality Act. And when it comes to providing, for example, sign language interpreters, the deaf people often have a real struggle to ask for fully qualified, registered sign language interpreters who have gone through the required training and deliver the required standard, because it is not mentioned in the Equality Act, which led us to this particular campaign.
If this bill passes, how do you think the day-to-day lives of people who deaf people in the UK will change in a sort of practical way?
I think there will be changes, and I will talk about those. we've had to accept a certain degree of pragmatism due to the limitations of bringing through a private members bill, not least a private members bill by an opposition backbencher who was 20th on the list. So there are some concessions that have been made, but I think there is an emotive success for deaf people seeing their language recognised. There is also a really important facility there for deaf people to point towards legislation that says, hey, this is our language, it is recognised, and when decision makers are using a factual matrix to decide what is or is not a reasonable adjustment, it just provides another tool for deaf people to point towards British Sign Language accommodations needing to be made. Now, in terms of the bill delivering that in and of itself on the face of it, well, we obviously couldn't introduce any cost elements to the bill as a private member's bill, but there is guidance. And as far as we're concerned, that guidance is pivotal, because that guidance will be issued to all government departments. And just to pick one example, hopefully that will ensure qualified interpreters rather than quote unquote cowboy interpreters delivering services.
And after this bill passes, if it does pass, where would you like to see the campaign go next, David?
Yeah, so it's a good question, because I think most people assume that once the campaign is over, once it passes, the campaign is over, and it certainly won't be over. I think one of the really good things to have come out of this campaign is that the 9 national deaf charities have got together, and we have worked side by side in bringing this campaign. I think we will continue to strive with politicians to review the effectiveness of the act should it pass, and try to hold decision makers to account should it not be effective, and see whether we can strengthen it if it requires. But what we have to do at this stage is, if we get this passed, this private members bill passed, we really do have to hold the government to account to ensure. The minister has said lots of wonderful things about what she hopes this bill will achieve if passed, and we need to make sure that we're watching those things, and if they're happening, if they're not happening, we need to ensure that we campaign to make sure that they do.
And it sounds like it's something that could facilitate much wider change. For example, schools in this country currently have the option to include BSL in the curriculum, but it's not something that widely happens in mainstream education. Is that a tangential, a potential tangential benefit of this?
Yes, for sure. I mean, the Department for Education is currently establishing a consultation on the establishment of a BSL GCSE, which is an excellent step. But you've obviously asked me a question, and this isn't quite the point. But let me ask you a question, if I may. Do you remember which GCSE language subject you took? Which modern foreign language you took?
Yeah, I did French and German.
And what grade did you get, can I ask?
I got an A in French and a C in German.
Excellent. Okay. And how is your French and German today?
Terrible. If I go to France or Germany, I'm more likely to speak English with a slight German or French accent.
Yeah, so that's what I was driving at. So you got an A. So at 16 years old, you were fairly competent at the language, but if you don't use language, you lose it. I mean, that's what we always say. But when it comes to BSL, there is far more chance that you will continue to use that language. you don't need to go to France or Germany to use the language. And that's why we think it is so important that it would just help people to feel included in society if people can learn to sign.
That's very powerful, and I didn't know that Geoff had got an A in French, so I've learnt something new about him. So thank you for asking him that question, David.
Yeah.
We're talking a lot about signing for English. What about other native languages like Welsh and Gaelic?
Yeah, so British Sign Language has been around and has developed for hundreds of years. In terms of researching specific sign language for, let's say, Welsh or for Scots Gaelic, as you've asked, we don't have much research on that. There are regional variations across the UK. And I suppose the most easy analogy to draw is accents and dialects. We all know that there are words that are unique to Liverpool, to Newcastle, etc., Scouse, Geordie, and what have you. And the same applies to sign language, because it's an organic language, and that's how languages grow organically with the local community. The proposed bill only deals with England, Wales, and Scotland, and the primary reason for that is because in Northern Ireland there are two sign languages in use: a British Sign Language and Irish Sign Language. So it's a devolved matter, and there is a bill hopefully going through the Stormont there. But sign languages has evolved in exactly the same way, really, as spoken languages.
And is there kind of an interesting adjacent issue around that in having British Sign Language recognised as an official language? There is a recognition of the heritage of this particular form of sign language, because there are sign languages around the world, and perhaps there's a way of thinking about this bill, aside to the stuff we've talked about preserving that cultural heritage.
Absolutely, and that's part of that emotive celebration of having this bill passed. It is really important to have that legal recognition, and I think what we do moving forward is that we as deaf organisations still have a lot of work to do to try and gain more visibility of the language, because you rightly say it's a part of the cultural fabric of this country. And we've seen a real interest. Last year we had Rose Ayling-Ellis obviously win the Strictly competition, and there was that very emotive part, especially emotive for hearing people, where the music stopped but she kept dancing, and I think that had quite a powerful impact on people. And it's that kind of thing that I think we need to take advantage of. These things aren't new to deaf people in the deaf community, but it has, I think, just given a little bit more exposure. It's given mainstream society a little bit more of a snapshot into the deaf community, and we need to really build on that, I think. So for example, both of you, I can tell you that both of you can sign. So, for example, if I were to ask both of you what the sign for goodbye is, just logically, what would you think it is? Yeah.
We're waving.
Yeah, exactly. So we're waving. And that is actually the BSL sign for goodbye. And I think the reason I use that as a slightly flippant example, not all signs are quite so iconic, but I think we freeze up when we meet a deaf person who uses sign language, and we don't think that actually we are using our faces and our bodies, and a lot of us gesticulate when we talk hearing people, that is, anyway. And just to add some of that when talking to a deaf person, hello, same sign for goodbye by waving your hand, good. This is not the sign for bad, the thumbs down, but it is a gesture that deaf people will understand for bad. And if we can just do things like that, for example, it just makes a huge difference to the everyday lives of deaf people.
I think we might be about to make BSL history here, because we have something on the podcast that I don't believe there is currently a sign for. It's called the Geoffocracy, and it's the utopia that will come into existence when all the ideas we hear about every week are finally implemented, with me as some kind of a supreme leader and Ed as a puppet prime minister. So the ultimate question will be, what is the first thing our government should implement on this? But firstly, I mean, how do you go about devising a sign for a new word like Geoffocracy?
Oh, um, that's a really good question. And actually, it's only fair that I say I am not a sign language linguist. I'm really not. I am a campaigner, and there is a significant difference. Not every deaf person who signs is a linguist and understands the language and how it evolves. I use it in a very practical sense, but I couldn't proclaim to know.
Well, we'll have to delegate that to a committee of linguists. In the meantime, what is the first thing that if we appointed you, I don't know, what would the role in government be, Ed? Secretary for deaf and hard of hearing people, equalities? I mean, what is the first thing you would implement at government level on day one?
Oh, on my very first day, very first thing. That's a good question. Okay. Okay. I think the very first thing I'd do, because I really think that it is the cornerstone of everything, is education. And I would try and deal with early years. Let's try and get the foundations right. Let's give children access to language at the very first opportunity. Let's support families that have deaf children to understand it's okay that your child is deaf. They're going to have so many opportunities, maybe not exactly the same opportunities, in some senses better opportunities, in some senses worse opportunities, but let's really focus on that stage of life, those very, very young children and their families. And if we can get that foundation right, I think everything flows from there.
Well, look, it's been really important and enlightening to talk to you. David Buxton, Chair of the British Deaf Association, we really appreciate you joining us.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.